Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Leading Yourself podcast. Today is a special episode, and I know I say this all the time, but it really is because it's the first anniversary of the Leading Yourself podcast. I can't believe it has been already a year since I published the very first episode. But this adventure of podcasting started way before that. It took me a long time to get started. But once I did, oh my God, it has been an amazing experience. And today, I want to share with you what I've learned in this first year as a podcaster. Welcome to the Leading Yourself podcast. This is your host, Carolina de Arriba. I'm an HR professional, health and fitness coach, wife, mom, and above all things, a goal-getter. In this podcast, we're going to be digging into all things leadership, professional and career development, habits, and relationships. This is a podcast for those who want to become the best version of themselves. Those who have big dreams and are willing to embrace the journey and put in the work to achieve them. My goal is to share with you the tools, tips, and tricks to help you in your journey. So let's dig into today's episode. Yes, it has been a year. I can't believe it. August 15th of 2019 was the day that I posted and shared the very first episode of this podcast. I don't know if you've been listening since then. If not, I'm embarrassed to tell you to go back and listen to that episode because it was terrible. But that was the whole point. That was the whole reason why I started this podcast. I wanted to push myself out of my comfort zone because I think that growth only happens when we step out of our comfort zone. So starting this podcast was my way to step out of my comfort zone. And oh boy, was I uncomfortable. You can tell it when you listen to that very first episode of this podcast. I actually recorded that episode in my daughter's room. And I remember telling you the story of how long it took me to even got started. And then I did. And now I'm here a year later, and my comfort zone has expanded tremendously in the last year. I've learned so much. I've grown so much in so many ways. And last week I was on vacation and I was reflecting on this past year and all the good things that have happened in my life as a result of starting this podcast. And I thought, what a great way to share and hopefully inspire you to do something outside of your comfort zone. Doesn't have to be a podcast, can be really anything. Okay, the other reason why I started this podcast is because one of the things that I'm most passionate about, one of the things that fires me up, that really excites me, that really fulfills me is to be able to mentor others. I've been very privileged my life to have people that have been there for me, that have listened to me, that have mentored me, that have helped me grow, give me feedback, all those things. And I really enjoy giving that back, paying it forward. And I had the honor to mentor many people in the last years. And I thought, how can I reach out to more people, even more people? How can I inspire and motivate and mentor and help other people grow and learn from my mistakes, from my successes, from my lessons learned? And that's how I came up with this idea of starting a podcast. And again, it's been an amazing experience. Many of you have reached out to me suggesting topics that you want me to share. And by the way, you can do that anytime by emailing me to leadingyourself@icloud.com. Many of you have also reached out to me and say how impactful some of the episodes have been to you, how helpful they've been. And every message that I've got in the last year with those words have made my day and have made all this past year and even before that so worth it. So, as I was saying, last week I was on vacation. We had a very long drive, and I spent most of the time on our drive back thinking about and reflecting on what have I learned in the last year? What has podcasting done to my life? So let me share with you. So the number one thing, well, they're not necessarily in order. I'm just going to share them. There's no one more important than the other. I think they all are very important. Some of them are new things that I've learned. Some of them are things that I already knew and I got to experience firsthand. Some of them were very good reminders or reaffirmations of things that I already knew. But they all have added value to my life, have helped me once again to expand my comfort zone. I'm a better person. I'm a better leader as a result of all these things. So number one is I've learned the importance of just go, just take action. The secret for success is to take action before you're even ready. And I think this was one of the things that I learned on the first day. I procrastinated about starting this podcast. As a perfectionist, I wanted everything to be perfect before I started. I wanted to have all the equipment, to know everything that is to be known before even start recording the very first episode of the podcast. And one day I said, okay, enough. If I keep in this track, I'll never be ready. There'll never be the perfect moment for me to get started. And I just locked myself up in my daughter's room and recorded the very first episode out of my phone. And let me tell you that it has been a year and I still haven't bought any equipment at all. I still record every episode out of my iPhone from the basement at my house. So that was definitely something that I learned even from day one. Just take action. Action is really what yields results. It's not knowledge, it's apply knowledge. And the only way to apply it is by taking action. The second thing is that there's many things that I've done, that I do, and I really don't know how I do them. A lot of times, this has happened many times in the past, people have reached out to me and asked me, Carolina, you're great at this. How do you do it? And my answer typically is, I don't know. I just do it. It's amazing how many times we do things in autopilot without knowing how we got there. And this past year, preparing the content for these episodes have really helped me to figure out, to get to know myself and figure out how is that I do things. What is that I do to get things done, to accomplish certain things. So I've learned a lot from myself in this process. I know I wanted to do this to share knowledge with others, but it has really been also a win for me and a learning for me. Related with this one, number 3 is that self-reflection is the success factor for personal growth. Personal growth starts and ends with self-reflection. All what I've learned in the last year, all that I share with you in the last year in every single episode of this podcast has been a result of self-reflecting. And I now got into this habit of self-reflection constantly in order to create new content, because I don't like to share anything that I haven't experienced myself, that I haven't done myself. So everything that I shared has come as a result of self-reflection. The next one is that you'll never get a yes unless you ask. I've got the privilege to have people like Scott Miller, Stacey Flowers, Britt Barone as guests on my podcast. These people looked, seemed, felt unreachable. I mean, I never expected that someone like them with so busy schedules, being public figures, would take the time to meet with me, talk to me and be a guest in my podcast. All of them invested over an hour of their time in order to be in the Leading Yourself podcast. And what I learned is that unless you ask, you'll never get a yes. You always have the no as an answer. The only way to change things, to get what you want, is by pursuing it, by asking. People is people, and I found that these people are amazing human beings, so humbled, and I learned so much from every person that has been a guest in this podcast. And I'm looking forward to have more amazing guests like Scott and Stacy and Britt in the future in the Leading Yourself podcast. Okay, the next one is take risk, be bolder. I have tend to be a little bit of a risk averse type of person in the past. And I think that I've taken risk that I've never taken before by starting this podcast, by sharing certain things in these episodes, by stepping out of my comfort zone, by reaching out to, as I said in the last point, people that seem unreachable. And I think that many times if we want to transform ourselves, if we want to be successful, we need to take more risk and be bolder. The next one is surround yourself with people that are better than you and have the power to inspire you. How do I get ideas for this podcast? Well, sometimes it's because I face a situation, and as I'm facing that situation, I self-reflect and I came up with topics for the podcast. But the other source of inspiration is really the amazing people that I've surrounded myself with. People that I know, friends, mentor, colleagues, but also people that I've never met personally. I call them my virtual mentors, but listening to podcasts, reading books has been a source of inspiration, and a lot of amazing people that have achieved more than I have, that are better than I am, have served as an inspiration for me. Around with that, I think that the counterbalance to that is that it's so important to protect your voice. When you surround with people that you see as sources of inspiration, they should be that, sources of inspiration. But at the beginning, I was tempted to imitate these people. And quickly, I figured out that I needed to protect my voice. I don't want to talk what other people's stories are or experiences. I want to talk out of my own experiences. I want to share in this podcast my own voice. And in order to protect my voice, I've had to be very cautious on not spending too much time just with one source, not to spend too much time in social media or looking at what other people are doing. Yes, I'm curious. Yes, I want to learn from others, but you need to find a balance, because if you don't, you lose your voice and you become an imitation of someone else. The next thing is, there is always a way. You will always figure it out. I have always, in my entire life, always have figured things out. And I think we all have the power to figure things out. Even hard things. When you're in the middle of something that is hard, that is challenging, you don't see the light. But I promise there is light at the end of the tunnel. And then you look back and you will be amazed of what you have accomplished. So I think that there's always a way, and you need to keep going until you find the way. I found roadblocks and challenges as I was recording podcast episode. There were weeks that I was so close not to have an episode ready on time, but I made a promise to myself that every other Monday I will be publishing an episode, and I haven't missed one, which brings me to the next thing. Never break a promise to yourself. I made the promise to myself when I started this podcast that I was going to be consistent, that every other Monday I was going to push out a new episode, and not any episode, but a quality content episode. And so far, I'm proud of every single episode. Yes, if I compare the very last one to the very first one, the first one makes me feel embarrassed to a certain point. But at the same time, it makes me feel proud of how much I've grown in the last year. I put my heart and soul in every single episode. And I did not broke that promise to myself of putting out quality content, sharing my own voice every other week. The next one is build routines and rituals. In order for me to keep those promises, I had to build routines to help me make sure that I was going to have the time or make the time to record the next episode. My morning routine has been very instrumental in helping me do that self-reflection, in helping me get the inspiration, the motivation to do the next episode. The next thing is you need to fill up your cup first. There is no way that I can share what I share in every episode and keep coming up with content if I don't fill my cup first. The next thing is always be proud of where you've been, but never become complacent. I mentioned it before. When I listened to that very first episode that I recorded, now I kind of feel embarrassed because it was terrible and it took me forever. I don't know how many times I recorded it until I felt somehow comfortable putting it out in the world. And now when I listen to it, I think it's terrible. But I feel proud because it took me almost a year before I even took the first step to record that podcast. I feel proud of every single episode of the podcast, but I've never have or will become complacent because I think that every episode can be better. Every day I can be better. And I want to continue to have that growth mindset all the time. I want to continue to push myself out of my comfort zone, continue to grow and learn and become a better version of myself. The last point, I know there's more things that I've learned. There's more that recording this podcast has done to my life. But for today's episode, this is going to be the last thing that I mention. And that is, don't overdo it. This is a marathon and not a sprint. I have to remind that to myself all the time. In the last year, I really had to make an effort to pace myself. I create content and I'm so excited that I just want to share it with you. And a lot of times there's been weeks that I was not able to wait, have the patience to wait for when I was supposed to push the content, and there were multiple weeks on a row that I put content out because I was excited. But also I had to pace myself in relation to my personal growth. This podcast has been an inspiration to become obsessed. Yes, obsessed is the right word with my personal growth and development. Personal growth and development has always been a priority for me. I've always been focused on it, but it has increased exponentially in the last year. And I started to treat it as a sprint. I wanted to read all the books, listen to all the podcasts, do all the things. And it's important to pace yourself because as I personally believe that becoming obsessed with something in the good sense of the word is a positive thing. But you need to keep in mind what the end goal is. And many times, and in this case, whether it's the podcast, whether it's my own personal growth and development, quality is more important than speed. A lot of times, I want to go 200 miles per hour when the road is only a 70 mile per hour road. And sometimes it's more important to slow down and really take the time to absorb. I always say this, but You can learn more by reading one book and really digesting everything that you learn in that book and putting it in practice, taking action, than reading 10, 20, 50 books in a year. So I really had to make a conscious effort to pace myself. And I learned that this podcast, and again, my personal development, is a marathon and not a sprint. So those are some of the things that I've learned in the last year. It has been an amazing year. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you every other week. I'm so grateful and so thankful that I decided to take the first step to lock myself in my daughter's room a year ago to record the very first episode of this podcast, because that was the beginning of an amazing journey. And there's still an endless road ahead of me. My goal is to reach to 1 million listens of this podcast. In the first year, I surpassed 5,000. We're almost close to 6,000 listens of the Leading Yourself podcast. I feel proud of that, but I also so humbled by the fact that you tune in every other week and listen to this podcast. I'm grateful for you, for keeping up with me, for your patience, for being there, for your messages. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And okay, as I always say, if you like this episode, if you like this podcast, do me a favor. Go to Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. And also share this podcast with someone or in social networks. And if you share it in Instagram or Facebook, make sure that you tag me. You can find me as Leading Yourself. With that, thank you very much once again. Thank you for making possible this dream of mine to have a podcast, because if you were not listening on the other end, I would have no reason to do this. So thank you, because thanks to you listening to this podcast, I have grown in the last year and I've become a better version of myself. And with that, have an amazing day, and I'll see you here on another episode of the Leading Yourself podcast.